Watson, you disappoint me. I never guessed. Saturday is an excellent night to steal bullion. It gives you an entire day to escape. I'm Chris Spivey.
And I'm Eddie Webb.
And today we're here to talk about the definitive Sherlock Holmes. Hello, dear listeners. Hopefully you've had a great, enjoyable week between podcasts. I want to start off this episode by saying that I have not chosen any of the Sherlock Holmes episodes this season. As Eddie has a deep bench of knowledge, I let Eddie choose all the episodes. There's no reason I'm saying this up front and now before we talk about anything else that happens.
I feel like that's you're throwing some shade my way, but I don't actually know what the shade is regarding. So
You'll find out shortly.
did you not like an episode of this? How dare
So
you?
one of the things is, normally we'd go and we'd like try to pull stuff from the internet and everything else. At least one or two of these I wrote myself.
Right.
Not how I wrote Murder by Decree myself, which is like this big lengthy diatribe of like criticisms. Because watching some of these, I had to stop writing just to watch it to see something, so I could then make a comment about it, and then say, "No, I'm not going to put that comment in there. That would be too snarky," and I removed it. It could be that these are not my favorite Holmesian stories, and I'm just giving Eddie some shit to start the podcast off
Oh,
right.
I see. Well, see, this has been kind of the challenge of this because one of the rules I put down for myself is that I didn't want to duplicate stories. So like if we talked about a version of the story in a previous week, I didn't want to watch the exact same story again with slightly different changes because that limits what we can talk about to some degree. And so since some of the earlier stuff only covered specific stories and usually the most popular stories, it does mean that by the time we get down to this later period, we're running all the big stories have been covered on some level, right? So we kind of have to pick through, and so uh, I tried to find good representative samples for the show. These aren't the best episodes, but also they're also are by far not the worst.
No.
Um, I just wanted to show kind of a good solid chunk of middle of the good stuff run, because like you're right. I mean, the earlier episodes of season one are actually really great, but also we kind of covered a lot of that.
Are
So
you saying that you would not have wanted to have gone through like 4 to 6 iterations like of the Sign of Four with different homes? Are you saying that would have gotten bored and stagnant by the second time we did it?
well, I mean, yes, but also I technically did do that at one point in time. One of my projects, which sadly got canceled, we were doing interactive Holmes audio drama, and so I literally listened to. I uncovered 4 different audio drama presentations of the same story, and wrote down a lengthy document of here are the changes that were made at different time periods and why those changes were made, so we could figure out what a modern version of this story would look like in an interactive form. So I've done that, and I enjoyed doing that, but I guarantee you no one read the document.
I thought you were going to say with my short attention span for things like that, it would not have gone over well with us either.
Oh, I'm lucky I committed to this much Sherlock Holmes, frankly. So there you go.
My snark meter would have been a lot higher. Joking aside, for me, this is in fact the definitive Sherlock Holmes.
Mhm.
This is the Holmes that I grew up with. I saw the Christopher Plummer for Murder by Decree with my grandmother, who I mentioned, and it meant a lot to me. But this is my Holmes. It's the one I saw by myself. It's the one who I mentioned a crush on a friend's stepmom got us all into watching with because she was super awesome and hot at the time.
Right.
I can't speak of
May I
now. I
mention
haven't
that?
seen those people in 20, 30 years. And it hooked me. And Brett's portrayal of the character was significantly different and more engaging. which
Yes.
is great given some of the stuff I'm going to talk about shortly.
Um, so yeah, like we had talked about how Basil Rathbone was kind of the iconic Holmes portrayal for a long period of time. Now it's Jeremy Brett, right? Jeremy Brett is the only, I'll clarify, English-speaking actor who has ever supplanted Basil Rathbone in terms of pure iconography, right? Whereas we talked before about a lot of the, particularly the 50s and 60s and even into the 70s portrayals were either a homage to or a rebuttal against Basil Rathbone. Jeremy Brett was the first actor to bring a frankly whole new take on how to present Holmes and play Holmes. And Holmes actors since then are now in dialogue with Jeremy Brett rather than with Basil Rathbone.
Mm-hmm. Much like the esteemed Benedict Cumberbatch in his portrayal of Holmes.
I That is a take you can have. I cannot take that away from you. It is wrong. All right, we danced around this.
Oh,
I think we should just.
oh,
Okay, we need to talk about this a little bit. Okay, so we're not going to talk. We're not going to discuss Benedict Cumberbatch's portrayal of Holmes on this because
what?
partially because
Eddie,
we're keeping to historically relevant versions of Sherlock Holmes. We're not doing the modern day interpretations, right? Uh, but the reason why I dislike Benedict Cumberbatch's portrayal is because it misses everything that is relevant about Holmes. I recognize that it is important and a lot of people enjoy it. And I personally, he is in the top 10 of all the Holmes actors for me. I cannot dissuade the impact he has had. But to me, it's just not accurate. And there are lots of reasons why. I mean, I put Peter Cushing above Benedict Cumberbatch, so you know.
but there's one where he wears a deer stalker. All right, I'll I'll stop beating
Barry Barry Ingram in The Great Mouse Detective is better than Benedict Cumberbatch.
I'll stop beating the Cumberbatch horse as much fun as it brings me in and come back to this. Because, as I said, for me, this was Holmes. And the fact that they made, I want to say, 40 of like the 60 odd Holmes stories
Yeah,
with Jeremy Brett is reinforcing that very premise. The fact that this show ran for a decade and only stopped because Jeremy Brett unfortunately passed away is the only reason that they didn't continue on. Speaks
yeah.
volumes to the impact the show had, how popular it was, how well the character was done, and the legacy of it.
Yeah, so we should talk about so Jeremy Brett was by his own admission manic depressive and also had heart problems, both of which contributed to his ultimate demise. And normally we generally try to shy away from the later seasons in the shows anyway, but in this case I also wanted to avoid the later seasons because Jeremy Brett is more visibly ill in later seasons. He was filming because he desperately wanted to get through the whole canon. He was very passionate about this project, and to the point where the producer and even uh, his co-star um, were like, "You really probably shouldn't be doing this." Uh, but ultimately, he said, "No, I could do it. I could do it." And then he struggled during it.
And he
Uh,
collapsed
it
on set, if I remember right,
at least once, yes, maybe a couple of times.
towards the end, like one of the final times.
It's is evocative of when we talked about William Hartnell in some regards. Of he was very passionate about the role. He was never going to get fired from it. That was never on the board. So at least he has that over Billy. But uh, um, he was ill pretty early on, and also his wife passed away during the first season. So he had to deal with that as well.
I think
Uh,
I think that was his second wife because the first
or
wife,
I don't know which one it was.
he
I know his wife did, but I don't know which one it was.
because one of the other things. All right, let's take a jump back and talk about Jeremy Brett. Jeremy Brett himself was a great and esteemed actor of like 4 decades worth of acting.
Hmm.
He had acting credits from like the stage, the theater and everyone else. The reason that Lazenby got to be Sherlock Holmes is because Jeremy Brett turned down the role because he thought it would ruin where
Oh,
he
I
wanted to
mean
go with his
James
career.
Bond. Yeah. Hmm.
Yes. What else is Lazenby known for? I'm the guest role in Get Smart. Come on, Eddie.
Well, you said Lazenby playing Sherlock Holmes. That's why I was like, I didn't know Lazenby played Sherlock
Ah,
Holmes.
thank you. But
That's why I was
so
confused for a second. I'm like, wait, what? I supposed to track down a new performance I wasn't aware of.
and for people that love musicals, Jeremy Brett was also in the My Fair Lady with Rex Harrison from the '60s and Audrey Hepburn.
Yeah,
He-
he
Unbelievably
was,
good actor.
and part of the reason why he was, I mean, there's lots of reasons why he was chosen, but one of the many was that he was one of the few British performers at the time who also had an American audience as well. And part of the way that Granada could even make this show was they partnered with WGBH, which is an American company that also does a lot of PBS funded stuff. So they have some American money, which meant they were planning to market it specifically to American audiences. One of the reasons why this is one of the more well-known British versions of Sherlock Holmes in the US is because it was releasing more or less simultaneously in both areas.
And Brett himself, I want to say, was married twice. Divorced the first time because his wife said that he left her for another actor. And he
Mhm.
has had multiple affairs with men during the time when he was also married. Never said what his sexuality was, either way.
Yeah,
And I still can't stress how amazing Jeremy Brett is. If you just go back and look at his acting credits, it is astonishing. He's like played Hamlet, he's played Macbeth, played Count Dracula in like the Dracula redone when they redid Dracula. It's ah, and
right.
then he gets to go and play Sherlock Holmes. It could be that's could be one of the reasons I love him so much is that the portrayal of all those things he's done before shines through in Holmes when you see it. And he made definitive acting choices for Holmes that influence the character, and as you said, now influence other people. One of the things that he also did is he studied the text itself
Yep.
that Doyle wrote and had his own Bible on set for like differences in the script and from what the original text said and for the mannerisms that he chose to portray for Holmes.
And
Like astonishing.
he fought for the Holmes or for the Doylean text frequently. At one point in time, um, it was said that one of the arguments not only went to shouting but almost went to fist fight. He was that passionate about it. A lot of this comes from Edward Burke, who played the second Watson and is the person who still he talks very glowingly about his time with Jeremy Brett and was the last Watson. He went through the rest of the Jeremy Brett series. Um, and Burke said that yeah, in a lot of ways the role consumed him. Right, like you said, you're absolutely right. Jeremy Brett was a fantastic actor, but Holmes resonated with him in a way that no other role quite did, and he fought so fiercely for Holmes in a lot of ways, and also outside of it, argued go to talk shows or interviews and whatnot would always point people back towards the original text. So he was also an advocate for the original stories in a way that very few actors of Holmes had really done.
Maybe as a
So it,
writer, that also really appeals to me. I don't know.
yeah, yeah, no,
Maybe a
totally.
thing.
It's he and I always I love this show. I've watched it off and on a lot through the years. I own the Blu-ray box set of it. Like I really like this version of it. But I always have mixed feelings while watching it because I know on some level this role killed him. Right? He cared so much that he endangered his life to try to keep filming because he really wanted so badly. He promised his wife, and part of it is also he says in an interview that when his on his wife's deathbed when cancer took her, she told him to keep filming, to keep making Sherlock Holmes stuff. So there's that on guilt on top of everything, I'm sure. But I think, frankly, the manic depression, because Holmes could be very much read as manic depressive based on how he's portrayed in the story. So I think that connection probably resonated with him. And I'm sure you would make this argument well. His sexuality probably also saw a fair bit of in Holmes too.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And one of the other things is like, I'm trying to think of how I want to phrase it, because all right, listeners, I've also been having an ongoing bout in insomnia for now for like over a month. So I'm
Mm.
firing on some cylinders. I will not say all cylinders, and there's only so much extra coffee can give me. So you'll have to excuse me if I pause a bit more than normal today. Is that, wow, I lost my train of thought with that one. All right, then I'm going to totally shift gears how I would do, normally not stating it, but we're on the podcast and we're like very low key and throwing everything out there. I'm going to shift totally off of Jeremy Brett and go in a different direction. Eddie, which Watson did you like better?
It's so funny because like most people will say the second Watson, right? Because a lot of people will love him, and he's fantastic. Don't get me wrong, but I've always had a preference for David Burke, which is the first Watson.
I'm in utter agreement.
Um,
Burke,
and part of it is because I've seen that first season so much, right? Edward Hardwick, I like Edward Hardwick, but he has a slightly world weary Watson, which is perfectly a valid portrayal. Again, I can't overstate like of all the Watson actors, like David Burke and Edward Hardwick are like near the top, if not at the top, right? So I mean, we're fighting over semantics here. But I love David Burke's mild, I'm tired of your bullshit vibe that he has dealing with Holmes throughout the first season. The slight vein of exasperation, I think, just adds a bit to it.
I agree. Part of it, though, for me, is that I think that when you have Burke and Brett together, either one of them could have been your leading man. And
Yeah.
so there's an extra sort of suaveness that Watson has with Burke that he doesn't have with Edward Slater. It loses that. And then it becomes definitely that it becomes Holmes and Watson and not Holmes and Watson.
Right. And I think part of it is also uh, I'm going to be a little blunt about this. I think because Hardwick kind of fell into the role of carer on some level during those later seasons in particular. So Hardwick was doing a lot of the heavy lifting that a lead should do, but trying to make it look like Brett was still on his game and doing everything fine. So I think that helped. That exacerbates that. What you're talking about here is like it is. He's so aggressively trying to portray himself as the deuter antagonist to Brett's or protagonist. So he's intentionally shooting himself in that slightly lower pitch, whereas Burke was matching Brett at his peak. And so, um, and it's good that you bring that up actually because this is at a point where the idea of Watson being a second protagonist rather than a subordinate or, as I mentioned earlier, a deuter antagonist, um, comes from really this series. And from here on, you start seeing more portrayals that actually put Watson at an equivalent level to Holmes. I mean, you could draw a line from this series to the 2009 Sherlock Holmes movie. There's a lot of connective tissue there. A lot of the portrayals that put Watson even more into the spotlight happen. Now, I will say one thing we skipped over because I was not going to force Chris to watch Russian movies is that this does actually have a few years predecessor, because Vasily Livanov's Holmes. Those movies also kind of did that. Let's put Watson on an equal pitch to Holmes and have them balance each other out. But by the time the Western world started seeing those movies, Brett had already established that format. So it was kind of more of a two sides of the world seeing the same problem and addressing it in slightly different ways. And it's only later on that the rest of the world go, oh, okay, now we're seeing both of these portrayals and how they kind of relate to each other. So going forward, these are two main characters, not a main character and his sidekick, which is very much how it was done prior to 1980.
Excellent. Um, One of the things of watching this again now and doing more just general Holmes reading and things made me realize how intrinsic Sherlock Holmes is in the theater and media, because most of these actors have some other connection to Holmes as playing some other roles.
Hmm.
I know that Brett played Watson in like the Crucible of Blood or something with Charleston fucking Heston as Sherlock Holmes, and then you've got Burke, who also played in one version where he actually was in something with Nigel Bruce. And Hardwick also played a smaller role. I want to say he played in the Greek interpreter. So you get like all these overlaps of them being in other roles and then coming back again to be in a Sherlock Holmes show in a larger role. It's almost like it's building up for them to have an opportunity to then go and step into one of the key roles.
Yeah, like as an example, I I've joked about this, but it's not entirely a joke. I do actually have a ranking of Holmes actors. My list goes to 39, but I don't rank actors I've not seen, and there's another 24 actors that I've just never seen before. I mean, including like Larry Hagman and Leonard Nimoy, right? I mean, uh, uh, Jonathan Pryce, Patrick McNee. So I mean, you're right. Like at it, especially from like the 70s till about the end of the decade, if you're an actor, a male presenting actor of some renown, you probably have played in Sherlock Holmes production at some point.
It's fascinating. Like that in of itself could be an entire series of podcasts and like diatribes we could go down.
Right. And in case you're wondering, uh, the dog who plays Wishbone ranks 28.
All right, let's do something that could potentially offend all of our listeners. Where's Brett on your list of 39?
Number one, just flat out number
Wow.
one.
Wow.
And all the time I've ranked it, he's never moved from that spot.
So,
I
all
mean,
right,
because he's my favorite actor.
2 and 3. Then we'll move on from your list because now I'm just
Uh,
curious.
Number two is Vasily Livanov because his portrayal is very Brettian, frankly. And then Basil Rathbone is number three. So I mean, it's about what you expect. Two being the oddball, only if you're not familiar with Russian Holmes media, which I don't expect most people are. But Russia is you have to understand Russia is into Sherlock Holmes, right? Like um, there's a statue of Livanov in Moscow in the same way there's a statue of Rathbone in the UK, right? So I mean, like, he's extremely well respected, and having watched most of those movies, there's a reason. It's a genuinely good portrayal, even though it's going
All
to a
right.
foreign language.
Okay, listeners, if you're actually digging all the Sherlock Holmes and you would like us to cover a Russian Sherlock Holmes or two, hit us up on social media or post on the comments under the YouTube videos and let us know if you would want us to do it. And then we may do a special where we cover one because that would bring Eddie unbelievable joy. And for how much I antagonize Eddie, I feel that I could give that much
Also,
because he's a good sport.
Seth MacFarlane has beat Will Ferrell, just so you
Yeah, I'm not going to watch Seth MacFarlane
know.
or Will Ferrell. I'm
They are
my foot
37
would
and 39, but
my foot would really come down, but it would come down for those. I'm not watching.
no, God, no. I have not finished Will Ferrell's Holmes and Watson. I saw like half an hour, and I was like, he's last. I'm not going to finish this. He's last. Done.
Okay, to get into the episodes themselves proper, is there anything else you want to talk about from the production side, from the actors, from random tidbits that you want to throw into this? And you know what? Before we do that, before you answer that, before we go there, when was the first time that you saw this interpretation of Sherlock Holmes?
It would have been in the 80s, actually. It would have been around the time it was airing. I want to say Masterpiece Theater was airing it in the US. Um, so that's when I first started watching it. And it's actually interesting because this is also the first Holmes that had copyright issues.
Hmm.
I didn't notice at the time, but it's something I have since learned about because the producers knew that Sherlock Holmes is in the public domain in the UK, and so they just started production without any kind of copyright thing. But because there was a joint U.S. production and Sherlock Holmes was not in the public domain in the U.S., they actually had a 2-year legal battle. So that's actually what's interesting is because if they did not have that legal battle, they would have come out about the same time as the Russian interpretation.
Wow.
But because of legal battle, they were postponed a couple of years.
Fucking IP
But no,
copyright.
I saw this on TV, and in fact, for me, this was the version of my head for a very long time. When I read the books, I see Jeremy Brett. I still, frankly, see Jeremy Brett. Now it's a bit muddled with some other actors, but Jeremy Brett's performance is very much in my head when I'm reading a Sherlock Holmes story. So it was definitely my first approach.
Do you see Jeremy Brett, except he has Henry Cavill's bill? Is that what you see now?
He certainly has more energy and enthusiasm. Uh,
Because,
this the problem is that
Sherlock's been the boxer. He needs
now that you're
that.
talking about Cavill, I just keep thinking about his cameo in a recent movie. I won't spoil for people, but he was very jacked in that. So now I have that in my head.
Yeah, I know. In Mission Impossible, where he almost beat up Tom Cruise.
Oh God, I was rooting for him the whole time. Come on, come on! Oh yeah, you have to lose. I know, but still.
Any movie where you flex your arms and it makes a shotgun sound, you're going to be the bad guy. I'm sorry if I spoiled that movie for anybody who hasn't seen it. If anyone in the movie goes "Caw, caw," when they move their muscles like a shotgun, they're the bad guy. Heroes don't do that.
Yeah.
They just chop the air when they run. Chop, chop, chop.
But yeah, I mean, I could probably spend a whole hour just talking about the production behind it. Granted, I've only been recently learning about it, but it was a very complicated process. But one of the things that I do want to say, kind of just through all that is important for our discussion, is everyone on the team, from the producers to the actors to the set dressers, the whole 9 yards, they were all absolutely committed to being as authentic as possible within the limited budget they had. They had to make compromises, A, for television, and B, for the budget they had. And some of those compromises did lead to a lot of arguments, but I think the result shows that a more authentic version could have been done. Because we talked about how in the 60s they were moving to authenticity, but it was still very much, well, we have to compromise for TV, and so they heavily compromised for TV. This was no, we don't have to compromise that much. They built the entire Baker Street set in Manchester. So like that opening scene with Baker Street,
Yeah.
that's all a built set in Manchester. And that's how committed they were, because they built an entire street and sets, and it's I deeply applaud the passion that the team had to make this, because it absolutely comes through, and that's one of the many reasons why it still holds up to this day.
And talking about building the set, well, people, now we've mentioned it ran for 10 years. When they built that set, they didn't know if it was going to be more than a season. Right. That is how committed they were. I want to add that context to it, is that they made a show of television. They hoped that it would run for a season or more. Yep. And they spent all that time and effort to build it. Like, that is commitment.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you want an example, just look at Disney Plus right now and see how long shows last.
Right.
Maybe a season if you're lucky.
The one big compromise, which makes total sense, but is interesting, is that Watson never married throughout this series, just because they felt like his variable marriage state was going to be too complicated. So in order to keep it a cohesive narrative, he stayed true throughout. So they adjusted some stories to deal with that. And the other thing was, when the show became very popular, parents became concerned because Sherlock Holmes is such an idol as a drug user, and so was Jeremy Brett. That actually, one of the few times he disagreed with the canon, said, "I will have Holmes completely put away the cocaine for the rest of the series." And that was one of the few compromises that Brett made to the canon, because he felt a duty to the children that watch the show, which is just a very cool thing to do.
I love that. Okay. Then let's get into it.
Let's get into it. Yep.
The Red-Headed League. The opening music and that scene of Sherlock at the window is what I think of every time I think of Sherlock Holmes. If I ever hear that music, I sort of stop and I turn and I look towards the camera myself in person. We see a red-headed gent looking perplexed outside of his shop. passing Bobby's escorting boxes while being spied on, and the spy delivers a sealed letter to someone. Then we find the redheaded fellow at 221B Baker Street. That leap! Look at Holmes go. Holmes introduces Watson to Wilson, London pawnbroker, their next client. Holmes and Watson play a game of I Spy that amazes Wilson until it doesn't. Wilson shares a peculiar newspaper clipping with him that his young assistant, Vincent Spaulding, had shown him. Wilson tells him that some weeks before, Vincent urged him to respond to the ad offering highly paid work to only red-headed male applicants. The duo went there the following morning and cut ahead of a long line of fellow red-headed applicants, much to their displeasure. Once inside, Wilson was interviewed and hired near instantly after passing a minor test of his hair. Duncan Ross states none of the other applicants qualified. Their red hair was either too dark, too bright, and didn't match Wilson's unique flame color, which Wilson gets a little blush at it being complimented too much. He explains their benefactor, a fellow redhead, who made millions in America and wanted to make life easier for other redheads. I wish that someone had made millions as a writer and wanted to make it easier on writers, and I won a contest like this.
Right.
The work only required him to stay in the building during nominal hours from 10 to 2, or forever lose the privileges. Holmes points out how strange it is that he must provide his own supplies and that must not be a very generous millionaire.
Yeah.
Stopping there.
Um, I have a soft spot for this story partially because it is both the best and the worst setup, right? So spoiler for the plot. This is a con. This is all a con. And once you know that, watching it again, it's like this is so obviously a terrible con job. But I love it because it's so fucking weird that I can totally see why it's like maybe this is legit because it's just so bizarre. Because usually con jobs you want to look as innocuous as possible. This is like, no, this is weird eccentric guy from America. You've never seen him before, but he's cool and he has money and he wants redhead people to be, give them a jobs copying Encyclopedia Britannica, and I'm gonna give you money for that. And it's like, okay, but actually, I do know of rich people who do stupid shit like this, so actually, that's plausible.
Okay. Even before I do that, I want to take a moment to talk about Percy and how great it was to see Percy in a role where he wasn't being tormented by the Black Adder. And so anyone who curious what I'm talking about, Percy, the actor that plays Vincent Spaulding, played Percy in the Black Adder series, and Percy was always a doofus for most of those
Yep.
series. And it was nice to see him do something that was a little bit more serious and menacing.
The about this series actually is that there are a lot of actors. You're like, oh, I know that guy, I know that person, and they're playing pretty different actors. Like slightly later, the guy who plays Lestrade did a lot of comedy roles, and he plays Lestrade not quite as a comedic foil, but some of that comedy timing plays into how he portrays Lestrade, which actually works out being really well. Marina Sirtis, who played Troy, was in an episode of this. She played a Italian woman, so it was not good, but she was in it, right? And it was like right before her Next Generation landing, so like it was early in her career. So that's one of the things that we have to show is because it's not just I know the actor, but they're playing someone different than I expect them to usually play.
Yeah. I've told Eddie about this show off air before, but Foyle's War is also interesting. It happens in World War II. It's about a detective that sort of stays back home. And in the first episode, they have the young Professor Xavier in the movie. God, wow, I'm tired. I forgot his name now. God, what's his name? If you remember who I'm talking about from the X-Men
Patrick Stewart?
movies. No, the young James McAvoy
Oh,
in the
Diane
first
McAvoy.
episode, like a baby James McAvoy in that first episode. It is so ridiculous, and like all the other famous big movie actors that are showing up in these shows from the 80s through the 90s. to see them when they're
So
getting their own starts.
similar, I've been watching the '90s show Sharp, another historical uh, fiction series, and one episode there was an asshole British noble leader, and after a while I'm like, why do those eyes look familiar? And it's like, oh shit, it's Daniel Craig. You know, Daniel Craig playing a jerk with more hair, and I'm just like, wow, that's so weird.
For back to this one though, that leap that Holmes makes of excitement when he sees Watson over the couch,
Yep.
loved it. It always
Yes.
sticks with me, and that is one of the mannerisms that Brett had decided to add to Holmes, and it works so well to make Holmes kind of weird. Because if you really stop and think about it, Holmes is a weird character,
Right.
regardless of how cool he may be.
This is definitely the slide towards a more authentic eccentricity to Holmes. And to your point, a much more athletic Holmes, frankly, which Brett correctly points out. Holmes is way more athletic, and also, well, let me finish my thought. He's much more athletic, and the stories bear that out. As Jeremy Brett wanted to put more of that dynamism into the character, but also while Holmes had been eccentric in past, again in the '50s episodes we watched, Holmes is eccentric, but it's much more kind of Nutty Professor style. I'm going to do a silly thing here, right? Um, Brett brought eccentricity that had its own logic to it, even if that logic was not always clear to Watson. And again, I think part of it is because Brett suffered of his own manic depression, so it was easier for him to portray Holmes in these exuberant moods, and then in later episode we'll see him in a very down mood. Um, so that comes across as eccentric and gives the character more depth. But since it was a character trait that Brett himself also had, I think that helped. Uh, but the other thing that Brett always brought to the role that I have loved, and frankly, I just don't think anyone's match, and frankly, I'm surprised people don't talk about, is his laugh. Uh,
Yeah,
Holmes laughs a lot in this show, and it's a very distinctive laugh, and it's so good.
so amazing. So, all right, there may be a lot of compliments for Jeremy Brett's choices throughout the course of the rest of this episode. Just be prepared,
Settle in,
listeners.
get used to it.
One of the reasons I point out specifically during the synopsis is how they walked ahead of the entire line of redhead applicants. Shows you straight up, this is a con
Yeah.
that Vincent is in from the jump, like hands down, because they show them going up stairs to get in front of all these
Mhm.
people. Like, obviously, Vincent has been there before. People must recognize him enough to let him pass through. I'm talking the applicants,
Right.
because otherwise, someone would have said something before they entered the room to go, "Hey, ah,
Yeah,
oh,
yeah. It is a terrible con if you recognize it's a con. But again, like it's so weird. Nothing quite makes sense in a way that gives it almost a sense of truth. So like if you're approaching a store for the first time, it's like, oh, okay, maybe there is just a weird club in England and this guy knows how to get past all the stuff. That seems odd, but okay. And even Holmes is like, I don't understand what's the crime here. When we find that out later, but it's peak. This is just the weird shit that happens in London, and occasionally washes up on Holmes's shores.
anything else for this bit before we move on?"
I do want to point out. I mentioned before about Burke kind of having that slight vein of not putting up with Holmes's shit. You see a little bit of that in this first scene. It's because Holmes is like just bouncing around, hey Watson, blah blah, and Burke's not rolling his eyes, but he's giving a little bit of energy of like, oh Jesus, what the fuck, Holmes, kind of like that.
Do you know why Burke actually left?
It was a commute apparently. His is too far away from his wife and kids, and he couldn't keep making the commute.
And I heard that it was that he and his wife had both been accepted into like the Royal Shakespeare Company for a different role, both of them together.
Oh, okay,
So that would have been good for their 3-year-old at the time to spend more time with them.
right. I knew it was because he wanted to spend more time with his family. Yeah, I didn't know about the Shakespeare role part.
I am curious, though, given that what we know about Brett, what happened in Hardwick, how Hardwick had to almost, how you said, become a caretaker for Brett on set. I'm not sure from what we've seen of Burke here that Burke could have been able to do that.
No, I think. I mean, granted, this is from watching more of the episodes than we're doing here, so apologies for listeners who haven't watched all of first season like Chris and I have. But I do think they were more elevating each other, right? Right. They were both actors pushing each other
Hmm.
and to up their games, and so there was not antagonism, not at all. They clearly liked each
No.
other, but there was a professional. I could just do a little bit better. I could just do. Can I add a bit more to the scene? Each of them rising themselves up, and I think Brooke really excelled in that environment. So if Brett was not bringing his A game, I think Brooke would have suffered. Whereas Hardwick is a much more accommodating
Giving
actor.
actor.
Yeah. Hmm.
Because the more we talked about this morning, it just had me thinking more and more about how that dynamic would have worked. Um, Wilson explains his own business had been on hard times. In fact, that he'd even hired Spaulding for roughly half of the normal salary he should have paid him, and Spaulding still took the job. And stated that he started the following Monday. His schedule never varied. He worked from 10 to 2 and was paid every Saturday at 2 p.m. The work was obviously useless clerical work in a bare office, only performed for nominal compliance with the will. After that, he made a copy of the Encyclopedia Britannica. Wilson learned much about the subject, starting with the A, and looked forward to getting into B section very soon. Alas, after a mere 8 weeks, one morning a sign on the locked office door explicitly announced that the League had been dissolved. Wilson went to the landlord, who said he never heard of Duncan Ross, who manages the League's offices. The landlord remembers the tenant with scarlet hair and gives him a card that directs Wilson to an artificial knee company. Wilson believes himself to have been the target of a practical joke. Holmes and Watson laugh at Wilson's expense. Wilson is upset and almost leaves before Holmes states that he wants a case. Concerned about the cost, Holmes assures Wilson that by Monday they will have solved the case and will likely be paid by another. After Wilson leaves, Holmes and Watson begin plotting. Holmes asks his friend to be silent for 50 minutes as this is a 3-pipe problem.
Hmm. And the con gets dumber. It's like you have to copy out the Encyclopedia Britannica. We're gonna pay you every day,
Four
and
pounds a
also
week.
like yeah, and then in classic, we're redirecting your website move. The address is false, and it points to artificial kneecap, which is just a great little detail.
I love this. 8 weeks, Eddie. 8 weeks. This dude went to that room every day and wrote the letter A and the different meanings of the words down. And I love the fact that after doing it for so long, he's so excited about A and talks about, God, what was it like? Architecture,
Aardvarks.
apes, aardvarks, ants, to a point where you can tell it annoys Watson. And Holmes is even slightly annoyed by him constantly
Right,
going on about A.
right. It's like
Oh,
yeah, buddy. But can we get back to the weird con job you've been a part of? Because that's the part I'm actually interested in. If you, I swear to God, if you talk about Antarctica one more time,
no. So essentially, he's made almost 30 pounds by this point after that amount of time has gone by.
yeah, which is not a small amount of money, right? Um, and I mean, the other thing that's interesting about this case is something that we don't see a ton of in terms of how pastiches handle these cases. Is that a fair number of times his clients have tried other avenues before they get to Holmes, and so it's not like something weird, mildly weird happened. They immediately drop everything and go to Holmes and say, "I don't know, figure it out." No, he did went to the police. The police were like, "You got free money. What's the problem?" Uh, and then he tried to follow it up. He tried to do the legwork himself and ran into a dead end. So,
I thought he said he came here directly after trying to follow up himself. He didn't go to the police, which I thought was one of the weird things for him.
oh,
I
that may
could
be in
be
the that may be in the
I could be
story, and maybe
misremembering.
something trim
Okay.
because I think in the story, Holmes Watson asks when you go to the police, and it's like they laughed at me. So that may be a story specific thing I'm remembering.
because here that is they say that he came directly to Holmes, and he reinforces that someone has played a prank on him and it sort of offended him, and so that's why he's here, like directly to Holmes and not anything else in the middle.
Right. The other thing I love,
Which,
oh, go ahead.
sorry, one more thing, the fact that you're intermingling the story with the adaptation shows how close they stuck to the text. Please go ahead.
Yeah, yeah. No, you're absolutely right. Um, and the other thing I was related to that actually, it's something that both Doyle does really well in his stories, and also this adaptation in particular builds up on, is that people act naturally in those stories. And there's just a general rule, not entirely true, because it's ultimately genre fiction. Sometimes people have to bend to the needs of plot, and that's frustrating. But like the bit about them laughing at Wilson, I mean, it's a natural reaction. It's like, I feel like I've been made fun of. I come here to solve this problem, and you laugh at me. And so he's like, I'm just gonna fucking go then, right? And they're like, no, I'm sorry, and they apologize. And it's like that's a natural human interaction there. And it's like,
Yeah,
I came here because I was insulted, and now you're insulting me,
nobody likes being laughed at.
right? So it's like, and it helps to humanize Wilson. Obviously, it makes him feel more like the sop that he is. I mean, he's definitely been, the victim of a crime here, even though it's a bizarre story. But at the same time, you're not mad at Watson Holmes for laughing, because it's a bizarre, silly story with a
Well,
weird ending.
my question for you though, is Wilson really the victim of a crime? I'm
I mean,
speaking specifically of Wilson. Like now, because he hired this dude, and this dude is in his shop, so that dude has a right to be there. The dude's activities are illegal, but they're not illegal against Wilson.
technically speaking, yes. His store has been defaced. We're not there yet, but there's a tunnel that now exists in his store that didn't exist previously, so they have damaged his store. So there's definitely damages against his store. The fact that he doesn't notice the gaping tunnel in the basement of his shop is a whole other
Yes,
question.
yes. See, I'm not even gonna let that go because I'm in agreement. But I was pointing out that like there's so little done against Wilson, and he notices nothing.
Right, but to your point, like, again, that's what's interesting about the story, is that even Holmes is like not entirely sure there's a crime here, and he ultimately just picks up because the story is so weird, right? If the people setting up the con had done a much more mundane con, Holmes probably never would have gotten involved, and they probably would have actually gotten away with this.
Yeah,
But because they erred on the side of being weird to disguise, it's like it's so bizarre no one will believe it's a crime. That actually got Holmes's attention.
it's the best part. Okay, Duncan informs his enigmatic employer, the professor, that the league's business has ended. Holmes decides to go and see Vincent, who Holmes notices has dirty trouser knees. Holmes then taps a pavement in front of the pawnbroker's shop. Holmes recounts all the adjacent buildings and comments that they may be being observed. With the case solved, he and Watson go on a date. Wilson talks about the how amazed he is. Wow. Did I write that? Watson talks about how amazing he is, yet how evil may be on the horizon as he stares longingly at Holmes while they listen to music. After this date, he calls Police Inspector Jones and Mr. Merriweather, a bank director located next door. Merriweather states no one can break into his bank. Holmes refutes it with the name John Clay, the Eton and Oxford educated grandson of the Royal Duke turned scoundrel, and asks Watson to bring the gun. I'm pausing there because I want to take a minute to talk about the date that Watson and Holmes go on. And Eddie's laughing. What else is it? He turns to Watson, looking excited that he's figured out the case. Doesn't tell Watson what the answer is yet, and says, "We need food and music. Watson, away with us."
It's just bros being bros.
Really? Come on. Come on, Eddie. We all know they're down to fuck right there.
No, uh, as I said way at the start of this, certainly queer readings of Holmes are perfectly valid, and this does not in any way refute a queer reading whatsoever. uh, I do want to point out, though, one thing that's interesting about this story is in here we have a chunk that's an adaptation for a variety of reasons, but it's an adaptation in a very specific way. Because we get the mysterious professor that's behind all this, and it's like, okay, anyone who has vague knowledge of how Sherlock Holmes works knows who this person is, right? It's there's only one professor of notoriety in the Sherlock Holmes canon. It's not Professor Merriweather, but that was not in the original story. So what happens here is that there's actually a mini kind of Moriarty arc that's happening here. There's a very slight reference in the episode before this one where we get a very strong sense that Moriarty's involved, and then we get the two-parter of the final problem and the empty house. So for a television perspective, you have to kind of build up Moriarty a bit more, and that's a pretty common problem we've seen before. And in a lot of Sherlockian circles, there are some gaps in the story about how John Clay gets his plan together and goes on that is solved if you assume that Moriarty is the person behind John Clay. So this is not just, oh, we need to slap Moriarty in here. They found a story that other scholars have said this probably works best if we assume a Moriarty figure and make sure to put that in the right place in the order of the episodes, that they can then more naturally inject Moriarty scenes into it.
Do you agree or disagree with that choice of adding Moriarty?
I completely agree. I think it's from a television perspective, you have to build him up, because if you just go purely by the canon, Moriarty comes out of fucking nowhere and then dies within one story. So you have to build him up. But I like the fact that in this adaptation, Moriarty shows up 4 episodes. And that's it. So he's not the eternal antagonist of Sherlock Holmes. And also,
he's not Holmes's Kingpin, much like for Daredevil, how Kingpin is for Daredevil.
Right. Yeah, he's not the eternal champion. And also, similarly, they didn't shy away from having other policemen in the show, because we have Inspector Jones here, which is, I'm pretty sure, the character that was in the original story. So not everyone needs to be Lestrade. So when you see Lestrade, it's more relevant and interesting.
Yeah, and I also like how they give them different personalities, though. So they're not all just Lestrade clones. Like Jones here likes Holmes and talks about Holmes has a making of could be a great detective, and you get once again that great Holmes laugh of ha, and he stops from the other room when he hears that.
Right? Yeah. No. It's so good.
How do you like how he deduces what the problem is and solves the case?
I generally I like it. There are some gaps here, and they're slightly weird gaps, but again, they're present in the story. Like from a television perspective, when he's saying here's the 4 buildings around where they possibly be tunneling to, like you're standing in front of the bank and going, there's this thing over there, this thing over there, this thing over there, and then I guess there's a bank here, and it's like, okay, what's the most obvious building they're probably going to try to rob? The bank you're standing in front of, right? It's like, gee, I wonder, of those options, which one is it going to be? And it's played like there's a mystery as to which building it's going to be. It's like, no, it's super obviously going to be the bank. So there's that. But on the other hand, the whole I banged my stick over the streets and I heard a hollow sound, therefore there must be a secret bank tunnel, kind of just skips over the whole thing of sewers, which were a thing. It's like there's a leap in logic that's certainly occurring here. So it's simultaneously not enough information and way too much information. So that whole scene, I've always had kind of issue with it. It's just like, it's okay, you're just jumping way ahead of the game and then going to And then the part that's really obvious, you're going, "Oh, that's a puzzler. I don't know which building it could possibly be." And it's just like you got to the tunnel part. You're confused about which building they're going to rob. I'll give you a
Oh,
hint. It's not the tobacconist.
I do love how antagonistic Meriwether is from the jump. And
Mhm.
it's like you're making me miss something that I have not missed in a decade of worth of time, and just like, oh, poured it on the Holmes. Like, you're an asshole for calling me in here. Why am I here?
And
Oh,
the funny part is, I actually love that scene because Meriwether has strong. I'm missing my D&D game for this energy. I'm about to go to 10th level, and I have to put up with your bullshit. Work called me in. I've been looking forward to the session for weeks, but no, I had to be here.
okay. Now that has me thinking, how well known or famous is Holmes at this point? We have Wilson that comes to him instantly. We've
Mhm.
got the detective that talks him up a little bit, but then we all instantly have Meriwether, who is antagonistic and doesn't believe that what Holmes can do. So there's feels to be a disparage between how much recognition he has,
Right.
especially
So
given the next episode that we're going to talk about.
yeah. There are a lot of different chronologies of the Holmes stories, but the way I understand this particular series to run is that Holmes is well known by most of Scotland Yard at this point in time because he's worked with them. But Holmes is still keeping his name out of the papers, and Watson's writing career has not taken off yet.
Okay.
So once Holmes dies, we have a 3-year gap where the Holmes stories start getting published, and he becomes more because it's this guy died. He makes big news. Why? Because this is why this person was important, and so that kind of starts happening. So when he comes back, he's much more famous in London.
Okay.
But also, to be fair, Meriwether is kind of positioned as this guy has two things in his life. He goes to the bank and he plays whist, and that's fucking it. So how famous Holmes is could actually be a little bit nebulous at this point in time. But also, John Clay doesn't recognize him either. So
We'll get there in a second. Eddie, what's Whisk?
it's a card game.
What kind of card game?
I don't know. I don't play whist.
Come on. You're over there now. That has to be like the game that I expect you to be playing every other Saturday with like your whisk circle. And there is a whisk circle. Your whisk
Whist
quartet.
circle.
It gave you an
I play
extra
Marvel
maybe.
Snap. That's what I play.
All right. Before I start making Thanos jokes, the four hide
Da-da-da.
themselves in the bank vault, where Meriwether admits that the bank holds considerably more money than usual. The quartet, notice how I added that word in before I used it,
Yep.
confronts the thieves. John, when they show up, and his assistant Archie. Under the aliases Spalding and Ross, they had contrived the red haired league. All right, I'm sorry if I keep laughing at that. It's such a like a ridiculous thing. They contrived the red-headed league to keep Wilson out of his shop while they dug a hole in the basement to break into the bank vault next door. Holmes reveals that their employer was his own nemesis, Professor Moriarty. Although paying Wilson £4 a week was expensive, it was a pittance compared to the ill-gotten thousands they were looking to steal from the bank. Holmes gives Watson 50 sovereigns, which Watson. I'm not gonna tell that joke. I even wrote a joke in there, but I'm not gonna tell y'all. Y'all will forever be curious. That Watson then gives to Wilson. We get a scene of Moriarty claiming that this is the third time that Holmes is actively involved in his affairs, and he vows to defeat him. Not kill him,
Beat
defeat
him.
him because he finds him interesting.
Right. And again, this is a neat touch because this is an adaptation, but there's a line in the final house, which is the first time you mildly convenienced me, the second time you incommoded me, the third time you positively hindered me. This is the last time. So that implies three more things. And so the show, again, like just super minor references. I may have been 2 episodes. I may be wrong. Maybe 5 episodes of this. Now that I'm thinking about it. But they're super minor. This is where the buildup happens. Like I know in an earlier episode, there's an entire subscene where he's trying to sell a fake Da Vinci painting, and something unrelated to that happens, and he gets the word about Holmes defeating it, and so he ends up having to scrap that plan because the other person might be onto him now because of this unrelated case. So again, it's put in because there's a specific line in the actual story that they wanted to then make sure that line made sense to the viewers. So it is adaptation in the name of making the original material hit harder, which is a very specific line and something you don't see very often.
Very nice.
Um, but also, this story is also great because it shows that Holmes is not above fuck you rates of charging people as a freelancer. It's like, this guy who can't afford me, whatever. Don't worry about the money. I'll just do it for free. It's cool. And then go to the bank and say, you, buddy, are gonna pay me because you have the money.
And I love the fact that he gets the money and then he goes and gives at least a portion of it to Wilson, who's elated to get that money because they ruined his shop in that excellent chase/fight scene with Archie and the constables, like top tier fighting. It takes me
Yes.
back to when we talked about Humphrey Bogart and his fight scenes. Oh, no, that's how good it was.
Yes, just because it was all in your imagination, because it was entirely off screen. That they had a bunch of actors go in the other room, yell a bit, and then drag somebody on screen. It's amazing.
Okay, how did you like the confrontation with Clay, who like pokes his hand up out of there for a while, and then eventually pushes the thing up and comes out, and there's Holmes and everybody else waiting on him.
So I'll be honest, this is one of the few places where the show falls down a little bit because the show is trying to be more accurate. And we talked about before that Brett was very passionate on making Holmes more active and more athletic. But it's still British television in the early 80s on a limited budget. Action's not in their wheelhouse. And so they're trying their best to do action things, but that's not, to be fair, it's not the show they're making. And they're putting them in just because they need to get to the next bit to care about. So, like, yeah, it's just, let's just drag him out, drag him out of the hole, and then shove him to the side, and we'll yell at him. We'll go back to talking, which we're good at. We're good at people talking in costumes. So there's kind of a Doctor Who-ish vibe on some level, right? Of this is the part we're not good at. Let's just get through it as fast as we can.
And okay, for me, my biggest thing was they said, "All right, we'll kill the lights," and it is just as bright as it was before they said that line the
Oh
entire
yeah.
time. There's that is my biggest Doctor Who moment for me when I was watching. Like, can you at least like turn off one light in there and make it a little
Right.
darker?
There was also telling Mary Werther to shut up and then having another 5-minute conversation right after that, and it's just like, you have to be quiet because they'll hear us. So let me have another conversation over here. It's just like,
Though
I get there's limitations of the television medium, but maybe don't lampshade them so obviously.
the implied threat that Clay gives Holmes when he references Moriarty is nice. That's like a nice little finishing touch there to once again reinforce how deadly the professor is going to be.
Yeah, yeah. And again, that's new, but it's done in such a way that for a long time I did not realize that Moriarty wasn't in the story. So like, yeah, like, and I ended up looking into research and whatnot, and it comes down to like a lot of Sherlockians have gone into what are the other instances that Moriarty was incommoded, and of course because Sherlockians are ultimately genre fans like all of us, they can't take the obvious answer of, well, we just don't know those mysteries. They know it has to be one of the published ones, or it's okay if it also actually happened in history too. So any of those are fair game. So we're going to bend the material in very specific directions in ways it wasn't intended, rather than just acknowledge that Doyle made this shit up because he was trying to kill off a character and get money. So a lot of cases have been put forward, but Red-Headed League is kind of one of the bigger ones of like, this is most obviously one. Silver Blaze is one that actually gets mentioned a lot because again, it's super weird con job involving painting horses. Um, so if you continue the thread of Moriarty tends to do weird ostentatious crimes, which is valid given what little we know of Moriarty, then certain cases do kind of uh, uh, encourage themselves. The stockbrokers plan is sometimes mooted, but it's a little too late. I'm not gonna go through all of them, but suffice to say, the more outre ones tend to get bubble up as probably Moriarty influenced because he's deadly, but also he's got much like Holmes, he's a bit of the melodramatic about him.
Nice. Any other closing thoughts before we move on, leaving Wilson in his shop?
I gotta fill in this hole. No, I think it's everything.
All right, we move on to season 2, episode 3, The Second Strain. We open with a noir voiceover to establish how serious the stakes are this time. The Prime Minister and the Secretary of State of European Affairs will be visiting Holmes privately and want to keep things hush hush. We see Miss Wilson and Watson frantically cleaning before the duo arrive. Holmes states and Hope states, the Secretary of State, Hope, states an important document was stolen from his dispatch box, which he kept in his home in Whitehall Terrace when not at work. They've not informed the police, and the public must not know. If they do, this document could bring about very dire consequences for all of Europe. Holmes questions Hope, who recounts receiving the document from a foreign power 6 days ago. He takes it from his office to his home, and it remains with him. They know no one entered their room last night, and Holmes deduces that there was a 4-hour window the document was left unattended. Only a few key people in England know of the letter, and even outside, only a handful. The pair of officials are hesitant to divulge what the document is until Holmes refuses to help, and they comply. The writer is a foreign national, ruffled by some colonial actions, and the contents would lead to war if exposed. It would be more dangerous to the writer than to them at the end of the day. Holmes tells them to prepare for war.
Right. So now we have Holmes as espionage, which is actually a genre that Sherlock Holmes actually dips into a few times throughout the course of his stories. And that's one of the things that I think a lot of people don't quite realize about the Sherlock Holmes stories is that Doyle played with more genres than just mystery
Yeah.
throughout his run. Because mild spoilers for the rest of the episode, but the actual mystery here is dumb. The actual figuring out a clue to figure out what happened is one thing. But everything around it is basically a political thriller. And so it's interesting to see that a lot
I
of
would push
other
back on your use of the word thriller.
political intrigue.
Thank you.
You didn't find 15 minutes of talking about how much war England's going to have to suck up to be thrilling?
So I don't know if Eddie's reading the document in front of us, but there is a note I have here that has 20 minutes and 20 seconds, a specific time referenced. And that is because we stay in that fucking office in this boring ass opening for 20 goddamn fucking minutes. I stopped watching. I paused, stopped watching, did something else, came back, and I'm still in that goddamn office, Eddie. I like 221 Baker Street, but this was boring as fuck. They're saying this document will lead us to war. Great. Written by a foreign power. Great. What's in the letter is deadly serious. What the fuck is in the letter? Tell me
Right.
what's in the letter? No. And I'm not loving the acting of either the actors opposite working against Brett and Hardwick. Like, I'm not moved by them. They're very blah. I did like Miss
Right.
Hudson and Watson cleaning, but it's very dull. And that's what I'm
Sure.
getting
Yeah.
to after all that bluster.
Right. And I mean, rewatching it, I realize that's certainly valid. And this is one of the downsides of being a little too authentic, right? Is the fact that if you're not deeply invested in the concept of British war intrigue in the late 19th century, then yeah, this is really fucking dull. Um, what I do like about this scene is something that again is played too strongly in some modern interpretations of Holmes, but Holmes does not care in some regards, right? It's the okay, so you lost the letter. What? And it's like, well, if you don't get the letter back, go to war. It's like, so go to war, I guess. I don't know what you want me to do here. And then it's like, well, you don't need to know the content of this letter. And it's like, cool, I got shit to do. Bye. Uh, Holmes does not. The prime minister comes in and basically, well, of course, Sherlock Holmes is going to do this because I'm the prime minister, and Holmes is like, nah. And that's the part of the scene I actually do like is that these two high politicians come in and just try to throw their weight around, and Watson's falling for it, but Holmes is not. Because like when Holmes is like, I have better things to do, Watson's like giving him the look like, what? And they're about to walk out until they finally turn around. I agree.
They walk out like
How the,
car salesmen walk out, Eddie. That's how they're
well,
walking out. We're
no, I
gonna
agree.
walk out. I'm not gonna lose eye contact with you if you don't buy this car very cheaply. Come on. All right, you got
Right,
us.
and that's the thing is, I agree the guest actors did not play that as well as they could have because they really should have been played like they should have tried to stomp out mad, realize what's coming on, and then come back more kind of acquiescent, right? Instead, it kind of just like, oh, this is mildly inconvenient. Nah, it's more inconvenient to go out. Let's just stay here. That's kind of how the energy comes across. So I agree with that. That's not great.
And for a very long talkie scene, you need, well, we've already said it, but better acting, something that's going to be more engaging to keep people, even if you're staying true to the text. And I'm saying this because we've watched a little bit of Holmes up to this point,
Right,
and there have been a lot of talkie scenes and a lot of Holmes. But
right.
those actors brought something to those engaging, to talking scenes to keep them engaging, to keep people a part of it.
Or they were cut down from the original text.
And here, they didn't do any of that, which
Right.
I appreciate the nod to the original text, but maybe if they'd done something, or if they'd given more inclination as what's in the letter, something that would have struck or resonated somehow. And I
Yeah.
understand it was made like in 86 or whatever it was. It is still ways to have done that in 86, given they did that in the 40s, they did in the 50s.
Yeah. Other
Now,
adaptations that
don't
could
get me
stand
wrong,
do usually have the prime minister coming in a lot stronger and being more of a dick, which usually helps give some energy to this scene.
it's not as boring as the 60s, but it was kind of boring.
Right. Right.
Anything else about that for a rant once again? Although, Miss Hudson, excellent job. I wish she had more speaking parts.
Yeah. I mean that's kind of well that's one of the reasons why I admit that again in retrospect I was rewatching and it's like, oh, I had forgotten how long this takes. But I I like the energy that Brett is bringing to it. It's not enough to carry the whole seat, sadly, and I agree with that. But um, Brett is really good at a very specific skill set, which is Sherlock Holmes listening to his clients while still making that interesting to watch. And if you compare Brett listening to Jabez Wilson and the Red-Headed League and Brett listening to the Prime Minister whinge about a letter, there's very different things happening in both of those scenes. In the first episode we watched, Holmes is trying really hard not to bust out laughing and kind of fails at it at points and eventually just gives in near the end. But like he's like, okay, go ahead, you know. And where in this one, you can almost see Holmes going, how can I kick these guys out? Because I just do not care about any of this. Which granted, sadly, the audience is also going, yeah, I also don't care about any of this. So that's not a great connection where you're empathizing with Holmes about how long this is taking and how stupid this is. But it is showing that uh, uh, Brett, and to a degree, Hardwick here, when you have to do the intercuts of person listening who's saying nothing, in television you have to do that. It's like occasionally just cut back to people where they nod or react somehow. Having them both doing something with their body or face to be interesting when they're saying nothing and somebody else talking over top of them is actually not easy to do.
Also,
20 minutes is too long, yes.
I can't help myself. I'm even moving away from that. The very fact that I made a specific point of mentioning the voiceover noir effect for it,
Right.
add to gravity to the situation before they bore you. But the fact that it's supposed to be kept quiet and no one's really supposed to know what's going on, and these two gents jump into like this escorted immaculate carriage to like go down the street from like their offices and everything else. There is no way that's not public knowledge. It's not in one of the 4 or 5 papers going out that day that the prime minister and the secretary of state are in Sherlock Holmes's office. What could be going on? There's no way that is not public knowledge, Eddie.
It's interesting you mentioned that because there actually was a law long before the 18th century where you actually couldn't, as in newspapers, talk about public officials in any disparaging way. That law lapsed, never got renewed. That led to a massive increase in satire and the rise of what we now call the political cartoon. But around the Victorian era, if a newspaper wanted to get wide circulation, they kind of had to at least check in with the powers that be if they wanted to report on certain things, which led to a very incestuous relationship um, that eventually got broken around the time of World War II, and now newspapers have no problem just slagging off anybody in power. So we're at this kind of awkward time where mass media and politics are uncomfortable bedfellows. And there's actually one of the stories where Holmes straight up manipulates the media. He flat out lies to a newspaper reporter to get a story put into the paper to drag somebody out into the light. Um, and so, I mean, this is the rise of yellow journalism too, and so
Yeah.
that's everybody's like, if you didn't want to be painted as a yellow journalist, you had to kind of play ball with the powers that be, which means that ultimately you're a form of state censorship. So it actually is plausible that they would have been Sherlock Holmes and newspapers wouldn't be reporting on it.
Mm. I still think a wily journalist would have easily put out something. I wonder what political figure Sherlock Holmes is saying today. I didn't say who. It could have been anybody.
Sure, possibly. I mean, yeah, something like that probably would have happened. But then it's the okay, well, which political figure is it, and how does it relate to this letter that no one's heard of? I mean, it's. I agree, it's a bit of a gap, but it's not as much of a gap as perhaps it will first appear.
And I do appreciate you bringing context for that law, though, because that's super cool. Something I didn't know about that I will now put in a story.
Yeah,
Lady Hope arrives later, asking them not to tell her husband that she's here. He tells her nothing about politics. She knows something was stolen from their house, but he won't tell her what it was. She needs him to say to her what it is. Home refuses, but let her know that it will negatively impact her husband's career before she leaves, wanting to know more. Watson drops a line about her, making Holmes jealous that he looks at her as a beautiful woman before the detective begins deducing her true purpose for visiting them. Moments later, Watson points out that one of the 3 men they wanted to interview has been murdered, and Holmes hits the streets. 20 minutes and 20 seconds for Holmes to finally leave that goddamn fucking apartment. The scene with Mrs. Trelawney is infinitely more interesting than everything that's happened before. One, because Patricia Hodson is just an awesome actress
yeah.
and a looker. And it was more fun because you could tell that there's layers to her character, that she wants something that we did not get from the other actors.
Right, because even though on some level there's a roughly similar conversation, which is that the client wants Holmes to do something that Holmes is reluctant to do, she's bringing an energy to this that Brett can then feed off of. And so, like, when she's doing I'm going to maneuver you into tricking you into telling me the thing, and Holmes is like, lady, no, I'm, I'm not. She's like, but what about this? Just no, I'm not. I have certain confidentiality. I cannot tell you get the hell out of my apartment. I mean, so but it's interesting. You're right. It's more interesting to watch. And your point about Watson or Holmes being jealous is interesting because how the line reads in the story is just Holmes going, I don't know, you know things better than I do. That's not how Brett plays it, even though it's the same line. Brett plays it like, how dare you? Oh, wait, no, that's your thing, I guess. Watson in it. But that's not what his face is saying. You're right. There's an actual performance change there, which is great.
And it's very reminiscent of Tom Baker when God, I forgot what story that was, where there's like a beautiful woman that comes in and he makes a comment about, I guess you suppose you're a beautiful woman for some
Oh yes,
people.
you're. Yeah, it's City of Death, where the evil Baroness comes in and Baker says, "You're a beautiful woman, I presume," which is a great line because it puts the "I presume" at the end. You think the one is that you're, I presume, and it's like, oh, that's so good. But yes, but again, like Baker does it like, I don't know. I've been told you're beautiful, so I'm just gonna assume that's true. Holmes, and that's how the line should read. Most people would read it, but Brett puts a little spin on it of like, how dare you notice that?
And I love that he's adding that context. I told you, has been there from the start.
Yep.
But more to the scene itself. The fact that once she leaves, you have Holmes trying to break down what her true intentions was, and Watson and Holmes talking about how she sat in the chair that gives bad lighting, so it's hard to see her face. In all of these things, it's well, and it shows them working as a team back and forth.
Right.
Loved it.
Right. And I also like the fact that a bit like Redheaded League, as soon as she leaves, like immediately Holmes and Watson, like, she's suspicious. There's no debate on that. To the point where if you're not paying close attention, they never actually explicitly say, "Wow, that was suspicious. We should look into that." They go right into breaking down what actually happened there. It takes you a minute or so into that scene before you, as the watcher, if you're not paying close attention, to realize, oh, they don't trust her. Right? It's not explicitly clear because you're right, they're so in tune as a team that they don't have to say it out loud, which means the audience doesn't quite hear it. But if you look at their body language and how they're presenting themselves, it's super clear they don't trust her. So I mean, it's nice they threw in the line, like you said, the well, she sat with her back to the window, and that's suspicious. Okay, that's the little bit of the line that brings the casual watcher back into where they're at. But they don't start there immediately. It's a nice nuanced performance because Watson is not doing the "I'm so confused. Why didn't you trust her?" Watson's like, "No, yeah, no, she's fucking sus." Then it's nice.
And it was also nice because it reinforces that she has used her looks and the misconception of women of the time period to her advantage multiple times, and it doesn't work in this instance. But we're going to see somewhere where it does work in a second.
Yep.
Anything else for this piece before we move on?
No, let's finally leave 221 Baker Street.
You sure we could stay there for another like 20 minutes and 20 seconds?
I mean, I
The
live
police
there, Chris.
arrest the police arrest him for murder, and Holmes states it's the wrong suspect. As Lestrade continues operating in the background, Watson updates the detective by reading to him from the newspaper. Such a boring ass episode. Holmes is too focused on why the letter has not come forward and how everyone is against him until they are pulled in by Lestrade during a bout of bragging as he shows them the murder scene. The blood stain on the carpet, but the blood stain is missing under it. Who shifted the carpet and why? The police officer comes in. They have a little joke at Lestrade's expense, and then, having officially fluffed Lestrade's ego in front of him, Home goes after the culprit, Lady Hilda. Her visit to give Lupus, the murdered person, the letter, who she took it from. All right, Eddie. I'm not even going to read my thing. In the end, you have Lady Hilda, who is the culprit. She was blackmailed into helping the person that was murdered by, to quote the thing, his fiery French wife, who
Mhm.
misconstrued their meeting with the lady. Holmes says, "Tell us why you took it." She's like, "I won't do it." And then a few beats later, before her husband shows up, that's when she admits she was blackmailed. Holmes tricks the prime minister and the secretary by slipping the letter back into the box. The prime minister doesn't really believe him, but the secretary of state says, "Oh, I didn't see this letter at all in this box that I probably turned over 1,000 times thinking it was missing."
Right.
And Lady Hilda isn't exposed at all. And Holmes makes another fantastic fucking jump in the air at the end of the episode. There you go.
uh, I will say this is one part of the story that has aged better for me personally, because when I read this as a kid, I was like, how can you possibly look in a box, not see it, and then look in a box later and go, oh, I must have missed it? Because you must be an idiot if you go looking for something and can't find it and then look back and it's there. Now I'm nearing 50, and I do that shit all the goddamn time.
All right, Eddie, I'm nearing 50. I don't ever do that.
Well, then I'm just terrible, Chris. My brain is bad and broken because I have straight up looked in a drawer, looked through the drawer, gone, honey, it's not in the drawer. She comes over, points the place where I know I looked, and it's right there.
Are you sure she didn't take it because she was being blackmailed and then slipped it back once she resolved the issue without you doing so?
I would love to know how my wife is being blackmailed because she has no shame. I think she wouldn't. Like, yeah, I did that. I wasn't Rocky,
Or
but
better yet, not even being blackmailed, that she's just not doing it to fuck with you sometimes. You know what? You've
that
been
is
talking a lot
valid.
of smack recently. Let's just do
That is
this.
valid. That because we have a relationship based on trolling, so that is entirely possible.
And now people understand why we're such good friends. Right there. There you go.
Right. But yes, the actual quote unquote mystery here is dumb. Hey, the rug shifted, and the bloodstains didn't match up, and Lestrade goes, I wonder what happens. Lestrade, come on, they moved the rug. Why would they move the rug? There's something under the rug, Lestrade. Give me something here, so
And
it's
this is so
not
painful.
great.
I didn't even want to read my own synopsis of it. That's how boring it was. Reading my own writing of the boring show made me feel bored during the
But
podcast.
I love the guy playing Lestrade in this, right? Because he has the right balance of I'm full of myself. I need your help, but I'm going to make it seem like I'm doing you a favor. And then the moment Holmes makes a deduction, him claiming credit for himself is actually I like this particular portrayal. I mean, I don't get me wrong, we keep going back to this, but the 50s Lestrade is also fantastic for completely different reasons. I like him for very, very different reasons, and he's probably up there in my favorite Lestrades. Um, but this is a really good Lestrade too, because Lestrade is not generic detective that Holmes keeps beating. Lestrade is specifically someone who chases celebrity, someone who wants to be seen as being smart, but isn't quite as smart as Holmes. And the fact that this actor is bringing some of that to this, which you just don't see in very many portrayals of Lestrade, I really like it. The fact that he goes out and just chews out this officer because Holmes. That's the thing. Is like he's like the whole time he's like, oh yeah, you like these tiny little mysteries. We solve the problem, but you just think out. Then Holmes goes, go talk to your guard. He fucked up. Lestrade's immediately go, right, I'm on it. I'm gonna go yell at that guy. Doesn't even question it. So Lestrade does trust Holmes, and explicitly even says so in one or two of the stories. He does respect and trust Holmes, but he still has to be seen as the guy who got the job done, and that's really important to Lestrade as a person. So he is an actual character in this moment. Yes, the mystery is boring, but Lestrade being a character is actually interesting in this for me.
See, I would probably be more engaged if I felt the same way. For me, this Lestrade is mid tier because I I'm not grooving with the way that he's grabbing for that fame. Or are you saying like how he's trusting Holmes? I would prefer if Lestrade was a little bit more antagonistic to Holmes, but they were still compatriots.
Mm-hmm.
Because Lestrade has a certain duty that he needs to fulfill, and we've already established that Holmes will lie to get to the actual root cause. But
Right,
you can't have the detective of the police fully trust someone that's going to lie to them to resolve the issue.
right. I guess I prefer my Lestrade's a little more slimy than you do.
Yeah. So, but and the purposeful thing of Lady Hope not telling Holmes anything until moments before her husband shows up, unnecessary, completely unneeded.
Right.
That was
Again, that was the
drama
original
for the sake
text.
of drama.
Again, it's the original text. Because this isn't ultimately a mystery; it is a political intrigue story, and that kind of uh, am I going to get you to give me the right information I need to make the right decision thing is a strong staple of that style of story. So from my perspective, it makes sense. But the problem, and I agree with you on this, the problem is if you're actually going to frame this show as a political story, the characters have stronger personalities to carry that off. And that's Lady Hill is the only one who's bringing a strong personality to this. Even the chastised police officer is just kind of there.
Yep.
He also should have been more defensive and no, just like she was fine. She I totally let someone who into a crime scene to taint the crime scene, and that was completely acceptable, and I totally think I should be able to do. Yeah, and this was that more of that energy, and it was like, yeah, I guess I fucked up, which is valid but not exciting.
And the prime minister knowing that something is off about them solving the case, just being okay, it's Holmes. Doo doo doo.
Right,
It's
right.
none of
Um,
this worked for me.
yeah, I can see your point. I feel like the earlier stuff, if there had been more flashbacks to like seeing someone write the letter, or maybe even a whole new scene. This is where I think being faithful is too much, right? This is the point where I think they're a little too
Mm-hmm.
faithful to the material. Um, uh, you and I have both talked about things need to be adapted, things need to be changed for good adaptations, and the people who say no, it's be exactly the text are missing the point of adaptations. And this is one where I think that maybe they should have listened to Brett a little bit less, and maybe they should have actually been a little less faithful, because I think you're right. Having a scene of the prime minister and other people scurrying around, giving the letter, seeing some of that on a screen as opposed to being told some of that, do an actual show not tell, would have made that first half better, and also would set the stakes better. Because the other problem is that you never really feel the stakes quite as much. You feel the stakes from Lady Hope when she comes up, or her stakes
Yeah.
are very much felt. But that makes the whole episode feel like we're ultimately protecting a woman's honor, and that's the whole point of the episode. Not, oh, by the way, there's also a world war on the horizon. That seems like that should be the bigger stakes, but really, Lady Hope's honor ends up being the actual emotional stakes of the episode, which is not bad, but it jars.
And that's not even coupled with the fact that we have the proper English lady whose honor they protect played against the French wife who sees her husband talking to their woman and instantly stabs him in the heart and kills him.
Right.
And they make some jokes about French people. Like it's all
Well,
right,
I mean,
I'm done. That's it.
yeah.
That was
No,
enough.
that's the other thing is like that. That's the one moment where they did show us the scene. It's like, yeah. The problem is like when you're hearing that story of like X Y showed up and then murdered the guy, it sounds better when you're just hearing about it. When you see it, it's like that actually makes no sense. It's like when you actually see it on screen, you realize that story is actually really thin. Like, no, that's the real story. So I mean, again, they pick and chose a little awkwardly, but the second stain, I still maintain is actually for me is a story I really enjoy. This is perhaps not the best adaptation of it, but again, this is strong. We're they felt things out. They're trying now. It's okay. We've done all the big stories. Now we have to do the rest of the stories, and how are we going to approach those? And not all of them are winners. This is a good representative sample of the show.
Sorry that I finally picked one of your preferred stories.
No, I mean this is not one of my preferred stories. But the problem is we covered most of my preferred stories. Like I love um the Blue Carbuncle version, but we've already done the Blue Carbuncle, so I'm gonna do the Blue Carbuncle again.
And so now, having said all that, it was boring, but the episode in itself was watchable, which is like the baseline of acceptance. So if I was gonna like recommend it to people, I would still say that you could potentially watch the second and still enjoy it. It's watchable. There are some issues with it, but I want
I
to
think
establish that now compared to if someone else had done that, like if we tried to watch that with Peter Cushing and so, I would have said, Eddie, we can't cover this episode.
that's more my point. Is like compare this to any of the Peter Cushing episodes. I'd watch this every day of the week, right? So like you're comparing it to the heights of something like the Red Dead League, which is just delightfully bonkers.
Yes.
And then you get this, and it's like, okay, this doesn't feel as great, but it's still stronger than at least 25% of the stuff we've watched and listened to previously.
Any other comments on that before we move on?
Nope, let's get to another episode I regret choosing.
Season 2, episode 4, immediately following that one, if you're watching it week to week, the
Yep.
Musgrave Ritual. A middle-aged fellow plagued by visions of a musketeer on horseback seeks refuge in a barn. The vision seems to hurt mentally before a young maiden takes him on a trip around the world without ever leaving the barn. Much to another woman's annoyance, he's too deep in to pull out. some way, some ways away. Eddie does not look at all amused by these comments that I wrote for this. Some ways away, Watson and his sick Holmes are in a carriage to Reginald Musgrave's estate, while Holmes drags Watson about. Someone may have notes of his previous cases before Watson. Watson, salivating the mouth, breaks out a notebook and says, "I want to know more." Holmes talks up Bunsen, the butler, while preparing for dinner. Once they're at the house, we get a glimpse of Holmes's needle on the table while he's in the shower, as Watson just walked into his room. Watson's distressed at seeing the needle. The butler burns Musgrave because he knows more about his family than Musgrave's does. And he's often making eye contact with Holmes as he seductively leaves the room. And I'm going to stop there.
Um,
Which
I mean,
part of
part of the
that do you
reason
want
why.
to talk about first, Eddie? The barn, the eye contact with Holmes, the multiple innuendos I put all throughout that entire first two paragraphs.
I'll leave that to you to have fun with. For me, part of the reason why I picked this episode is because grumpy sick Holmes is I love. I just love it. It's like I'm sick. I'm cold. I'm tired of your bullshit, and I have to do a mystery. God damn it. I I actually I like that. And it's because it's the no, we're gonna go here. We're gonna hang out with my friend. He's like, fine, I'll bring my notes, and it's the sort of equivalent of I'm gonna bring my laptop with me, get some writing done. You know?
You say friend. We get from the jump that Holmes went to school with this person, but they're not friends. Well, he's
Well,
Holmes's friend, but Holmes is not his friend.
well, right. It's the Holmes is like, I guess this is what friends do. I mean, you very much get the vibe of like Holmes doesn't know how friends work, which is fine, and it's great because Watson is his actual friend, and we've long been established. Um, so having Holmes deal with social obligations is something we don't see very often. Say I'm going to go visit my friends, and we're going to do the social thing, and I'm gonna get some actual work done while I'm dealing with this. And it's like I've been there. I feel that pain. It's the I'm gonna do this, but also I'm gonna bring my laptop just in case I have to answer a few emails.
It was I don't even know what to say about this. I dragged the other episode, so Eddie's like has this look. He's like waiting for me to do something.
No,
Um,
I said I regret choosing this one for a couple of reasons.
it was interesting though to see a butler be as mm, what's the right word as obstinate to his employer than we've seen in a lot of things. Knowing a bit about the time period, a butler like that would have probably been dismissed a long time ago, just from like their behavior and potentially the shame it would have brought to the Musgrave household, and wouldn't have, and Lord Musgrave wouldn't have taken the bullshit that he constantly gets. If that butler's burning him in front of Holmes, that means he's burning him in front of all of the guests he comes all the time, and degrading someone who probably considers himself a little bit of a scholar and historian.
Right, and I think that's intentional, right? I think that's Doyle going, no, we the butler shouldn't act this way. We as the reader should be going, that's weird. And also talks a bit about Musgrave's personality is that he's kind of someone that rolls over a lot, and he lets the butler take advantage of him like that. So it's definitely character building, but it is very subtle.
And we would get that also just from Holmes' relationship with him, because even when Holmes shows up and you know what, Reginald is like, "Hey, how you doing, Holmes?" And Holmes goes, "How's your wife, Reginald?" And I've never been married. It's like, oh yeah, like
Right,
even that level of I do not care about you as a person.
right, right. I mean,
Ugh.
it doesn't speak great for Musgrave, but it does set up to a counterpoint from the previous episode. From the jump, all the characters are interesting, right? It's that what is the social dynamic here, and Holmes is kind of thrown into this. So you're set to believe, oh, it's going to be Musgrave and Holmes, it appears, but no, really, it's Brunton and Holmes that turn out to actually be the peers in this, and Holmes recognize pretty quickly twigs something's up with Brunton, and what you may interpret as sexy eye contact, I interpret it as Brunton going, oh, this fucking guy's here, I better get my shit together.
I still interpret it as sexy eye contact because we learned that Brunton has left his wife. Since then, he's become a lot more randy around the area, and you have Holmes showing up, and it could have been a chance if it was made today to have been sort of that romantic comedy where Holmes uses Brunton to make Watson jealous.
Yeah.
Is a dynamic I would have
Oh yeah.
layered over this entire episode.
Absolutely.
Um, anything else about all that before we move on? We could talk
Nope.
about the needle if we want to, because this is the first time I think they've really shown a general shot of the needle and Holmes is
Oh yeah.
implied for this addiction for it. They don't
Uh,
state
uh,
it, but Watson's disgusted by it and then leaves, and it's just out in the open to show that it's part of Holmes's character. And we
yeah.
know that
I
Holmes is bored right now too.
yeah. And I alluded to that. But akin to Moriarty, the Holmes's addiction is something that there were scenes added to these stories to kind of give that more of a through line through the show. Um, and again, this is one where Brett pushed back sometimes, but also Brett encouraged playing it up more because this is part of the character. The character's an addict. I feel like this needs to be addressed. And Holmes's addiction was almost never addressed in adaptations prior to this. This is one of the first big adaptations where Holmes as a drug addict was actually on-screen textual thing and also resolved. Granted, from someone like me who's lived through people with addiction a very unsatisfying way. Holmes is like, oh, I'm just done. I'm going to bury the needle and I'm no longer an addict. That's cool. But I get why it needed to be done, like I talked about earlier.
Yeah.
So I'm not mad about it, and I'm glad other adaptations realized there was a void that could be filled there. But like that's something to kind of really think about is that until 1980, the pop culture consensus of Sherlock Holmes did not include drug addiction.
Hmm.
It really was the Granada series that pushed that forward, and most adaptations since then are not all of them address drug addiction, but it's much more common.
Okay.
A counter to go back to our earlier point, uh, Benedict Cumberbatch Sherlock doesn't really address it, but Johnny Lee Miller's Elementary absolutely does. It's a vital part of the character in Elementary.
Hmm.
Um, the 2009 movie dances around it a bit, but Robert Downey Jr. has a history with alcoholism, and so he's bringing
Yeah.
some of that to the part too. So yeah, it becomes part of the conversation, even if much like with Watson, sometimes the conversation is to refute against it, but it's now in the room, and it's the first time it's come into the room. So you're right; these scenes were added because Brett felt it was important to continue to reinforce. He's bored, like you said, so he's going to need this because that's what's established, and that's how addicts work. Until kids, parents got concerned and they said, "No, I can't do this anymore."
At breakfast, Rachel, the maid who witnessed Brunton the butler and his friend in the barn, drenches a cheerful Watson in coffee at the mention of Brunton's name. She reveals he's nowhere to be seen. Still sick and wrapped in a blanket, Holmes investigates the butler's room, noting all the butler's possessions are still in his room. Strange for a man who would have left. After hunting, Musgrave confides in a steel blanket-clad Holmes and recently returned from hunting Watson what transpired last night. He found the butler in the library late going through his family documents. He dismissed the butler right then, but the butler begs him that he can't take that sort of disgrace and let him stay for a month. Musgrave acquiesced to some extent, giving him a week before he would have to leave, come with whatever story he wanted. But it's too long. So now I misread my own note again. Wow, I'm off today. Then they all go there, go back to the library. Home focuses on the paper. It's a copy of the Musgrave Ritual. It was written in 17th century, and he has both Musgrave and Watson read it to him. And it turns out it's a treasure hunt.
Hmm. So we now have Sherlock Holmes does riddles. That's basically what this story structure is. Let's solve a riddle, which is fine. Um, I do love that Jeremy Brett is using the blanket to show Holmes's indication of interest. So like when Musgrave's talking to him, Holmes is like just clutching the blanket tighter to him, like, no, no, I'm sick. You can't be social with me. Please go away. But as soon as the mystery starts popping up, suddenly the blanket starts to slide off. And then by the time we're getting to the actual solving things, the blanket is gone. And so like that little visual bit of interest tells the audience that Holmes is like, I don't give a fuck. Oh wait, no, I give a fuck now. So Holmes in a blanket is
Um,
just great.
and once again, you get a portrayal of that Holmes is not that social with any of these people, because you have a hunting trip that Watson eagerly takes part of with a group of other gentlemen, and Holmes is sitting by himself in a blanket and sort of vaguely hand nods to the group of them as they come by. So once again, showing that Holmes is not the best friend to have.
Right. But going back to Brunton and Musgrave, like again, the uh uh and but like, hey, you're going through my shit. You're dismissed. And Brunton's like, can I have a month? And anyone else would be like, no, get out now. You have been found stealing shit. Go. But it's like, I guess I'll give it a week. And it's just like,
I'd push back on that. Brunton was more pleading and actually had a concern on his face. And the mention, I think, of disgrace for him as a person meant he probably wouldn't have been able to get another job. So
mm-hmm,
appealing to someone's humanity,
mm-hmm.
because we've seen a lot of Brunton up to now, and that is definitely not how that character had acted at all, which would have been a vast shift.
I mean, fair, but um, it does reinforce that Musgrave still. Okay, let me clarify one because it's a valid pushback. But Musgrave is still weak-willed. Musgrave convinces himself he does it because he's a person that takes all things in advice and considers all options. But really, Musgrave is a bit weak-willed, and we see that kind of here. So Musgrave's kind of deluding himself, thinking, "Oh, I'm being charitable and giving him a week, but still being firm." But uh, 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 Brunton's actually manipulated him into this moment.
Yeah.
Um, and so again, like this is, if anyway, this is the acting we were kind of missing in the previous episode, is the sense that you're getting this from the portrayals a little bit. It's not textual because again, in the text of the book, it's a little less clear how Brunton's being played. But here, it's like no, Brunton's clearly like he's a chick magnet, and he's confident and a little snide. We're getting that charisma across more. And so when he talks his way out of this, it's it, it, I hate to say this, but it had very strong vibes of Gambit. Like, no, mon ami, you don't understand. I was just comforting her, you see. You know.
I agree with you, but the thing is, Brunton wasn't stealing anything at the time. He was rifling through his papers. Given the fact that we have established that Brunton knows more about the history of the family than Musgrave does, part of it could have also been that Musgrave is trying to fire Brunton because of like the years of him being a dick,
Sure,
and then second guesses himself at the last minute.
but still, he was in a part of the. Oh, okay, yeah, he didn't actually steal anything, but he was in a part of the house they wasn't supposed to be in, going through private papers. So, to all intents and purposes, it looked like he was in the act of stealing something.
Yeah. Oh, and I don't disagree. Musgrave is a weak character completely
Right,
here.
right, right.
But it also, at the same time, you get a thing that it could have been like his general dislike for this person firing him and a moment of
Sure.
humanity. So that's why this was a fun part for me to watch, because then you get to like debate about which aspects of his character you think is winning. Is it his weak-willed nature, or is it the fact that he wants to have a little bit more humanity for someone who's potentially now going to be unemployed forever?
No, and that I agree with. Because again, Doyle tends to be pretty good at writing people, and could have been a very simple. The butler is evil, and the good-natured homeowner is giving him a chance. No, there's a lot more layers of complexity here because these are actual people. And you're right that this is a point where we could have this kind of debate about that one scene, which we couldn't really have in the 20 minutes of the previous scene because it was just like, yeah, they're going to keep talking about stuff. So there's actual interesting characters here who have their own goals and agendas on top of the other mysteries going on here.
Anything else before we wrap this up?
Nope, let's finish off.
That night, Rachel awakens and runs out into the moors, the woods, yelling, and disappears into the lake. While looking for her body the next day, a mysterious bag is found with nothing obvious about it. Holmes is sure that he can solve the case if he can figure out the map. Now that Holmes is fully engaged in the case, he's no longer blanket clad or sickly.
Mhm.
While exploring the lawn with both Musgrave and Watson as assistants, Musgrave recalls Brunson on his private lawn inquiring about the height of an elm tree that was struck by lightning years ago. And Holmes says the answer lies in trigonometry. And we get some mathing going on, a lot more mathing, a little bit more mathing. Do you know what happens after that? A little bit more mathing. And they
I love the
yes.
fact that trigonometry is the key part of this episode.
And then we get this great scene of Musgrave rowing a boat with Holmes standing at the head of it and Watson sitting idly. Musgrave, the nobleman, rowing the boat for these two. And we eventually discover Bronson's body inside of where the treasure is supposed to be hidden. And Holmes then deduces what should have occurred after a lengthy period of him sitting in quiet reflection, and Watson explaining that Holmes likes to place himself in the mind of the victim to see what happens. And
Right.
his deductions is that Brunton needed the help of Rachel to come and help him lift the heavy stone slab. They didn't find anything of interest that they could figure out. Rachel, possibly in a fit of rage, maybe by accident, let the lid close on top of him. He suffocated and died, and she was driven to madness by grief. And Holmes thinks that she escapes. The
Right.
ending scene is the friend of Brunson from we started the episode with finds her body floating up out of the water in a very dramatic moment. End of show.
Right. So I will start by saying Doyle has not been the most respectful at representing mental health. Let's just put that out there. But I do like the fact that it is ambiguous what actually happens. Uh, Holmes is like, I deduced what's happened here, and of course it's Holmes, so it's like I know exactly what happened. But it's super clear, even from the context of the show. It's like Holmes is kind of filling in some gaps. He's like, I'm guessing that's what happened here. Like again, Rachel's motivation. It's like could be either of these things. The way it's framed on the TV, it's even a little ambiguous, so we don't know exactly what happens. You could fill in your own gaps there. That said, uh, Holmes is like, okay, I reasonably confident about this. I'm a little unsure about this, but I'm absolutely sure that this buried chunk of junk is the crown of the king of it. I'm like, what?
And he's not wrong as he assembles it into a crown shape. Do you like? I purposely left that out because it was like that is just.
And that's where my wife, who's an anthropologist and does a little has some archaeology, is like, no, that's not how archaeology works at all. I'm gonna compile some. That's how we get fake dinosaurs. Holmes is like, just put some bones next to each other, and I built dinosaur. That's a new dinosaur I've discovered. It's not. No, that's not how it works.
But Eddie, he polished it, and it was gold, and it put together. It forms a crown. They even found a little gem that would have went inside of the crown.
Right. That's exactly how that works. Also, the crowns that time didn't traditionally have gems in them, But okay, whatever. But I mean, that's not the point, right? The point is ultimately of all the genres, this is a treasure hunt. This is a treasure story. It's you got a cool cryptic clue, and you got a map, and you have to find the treasure. And there's a little side bit of murder that happens there, although whether it's murder or just accidental homicide, a little unclear. You get a little bit of gothic comeuppance as the manipulative butler ends up getting hoisted by his own petard and trapped. You think you would, for all as smart as you were, you think you'd figure out a better way of keeping the door open, but whatever. He was rushed, maybe.
Logs. Well, he only had a week's time.
Right. See, if he had a month, he could have an elaborate pulley system that he could have built.
My My biggest complaint about that is he should have said, he'd have stuck to it. You have till tomorrow morning.
Right.
Then you got to get the fuck out. And then that would have shown why he was so rushed to do everything. Given a week's
Right.
time, he could have found it, knew it was too heavy, and thought of a better way to do it, and came back the next day or the day after.
Right. Yeah. I agree. The time frame is off a bit. Um. But I mean, it's a fun story, right? Again, I just love the fact it's like trigonometry. We know how tall this tree is. We know how long the shadow is. And the point is, the episode makes an effort of showing you and doing the math. Like Holmes shows his work. Like, well, Watson, if it's this long, how long is it? And Watson knows the answer because Watson also knows trigonometry.
But Watson is wrong, and
Slightly
Musgrave
off.
corrects him.
Right. Right.
He's Eddie. If you do a math problem and you give me the wrong answer, I don't care if it's 1 point off. It is still wrong. Watson was wrong. Musgrave says blah 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 blah, which in a way could be a little classism to show that Musgrave in his higher education knows more than Watson does.
Yeah. Possibly. Yeah.
Little dig there that Doyle put in.
But the thing is that so many other portrayals of Watson are like, I don't know, right? But this was like, here's what 2 points off, right? It's like, it's not, he's doing the math in his head and just came to slightly wrong answer, which for a doctor is a little concerning, not gonna lie. I don't want you to get my dosage of medication wrong if you're doing that kind of math in your head.
Well, we've seen what happens with that, thanks
Yeah.
to Knives Out. It was nice. It was nice to show, though, that as Holmes is doing his stuff, they reinforce how smart the butler is, because he's like, this is a hole right here that he would have dug. So little touches like that to reinforce how brilliant that butler was.
Yeah, and little things like when they go there and then, they put their stake down. It's really close to where they find the other stake would have been. Yeah, little things like that. It does a really good job of building Brunton up as a character that, frankly, Brunton and Holmes don't share very many scenes together at all. I think it's like one, maybe two scenes that they actually share together. So everything else Holmes is getting secondhand from people, which means we as the audience are getting a lot of buildup of how smart this guy is, how charismatic this guy is. And there's I'm pretty sure there are passages out there where Brunton actually survived and becomes like another villain for Holmes because he's on that level, right? He's not quite Morality level, but he's pretty close. He's a capable villain for Holmes.
I would have liked to have seen, my version would be that he survives and then becomes his own consulting detective who's a rival to Holmes and not a villain.
There you go. Exactly.
Yeah. He lives at
criminal.
He lives at like 121A Baker Street.
He's just down the road. He has another sign up. See, Holmes, because my last name begins with B, I am before you in the dictionary, in the phone book. So people will call me first. I have outwitted you.
And that would be the whole thing. It's only like a 5-minute story every week, but still, it's right there. Okay. This episode would not have worked if not for the sheer bonkersness of the actor that played the butler.
Yeah.
Like, he carries this episode. Given that Brett was having to play differently and play sickly until he got into the case, which lowered the greatness that he normally brings. And I understand this is a Watson that then did the rest of the run with Brett all the way to the end. They did like 9 seasons of the show, like 5 movies. They had like a stage production of Sherlock that they did together.
For a year.
Still
almost.
pales in comparison to Burke.
Yeah. Right, because again, he's doing a subdued thing, but I see your point. Like, if it hadn't been for Brunton, everyone would be subdued. Because Musgrave has to be a weak character.
Just by the writing.
Rachel has to ramp up to her crazy. So everyone would have been on a lower level. So Brunton, and it helps they had not a cold open, but they had the earlier scene before Holmes to show up, of Brunton doing stuff to kind of establishing him as a larger than life character. So I mean, yeah, as much as I hate to go back to Doctor Who, I mean, it's kind of the same thing. Like, sometimes a good villain's all you need to have a modest story turn around. And I think this certainly helps in this case.
If I was watching it week to week, I don't know if I would have come back for episode 5. I would have probably take a break, because these two back to back.
Honestly, this is when I do rewatches. Mid season 2 is where I start to peter out, and I have to kind of take a break before I come back. And
See,
I hadn't thought through, but like there's another one after this. It's also a little low energy. So I think this is kind of just a lull, frankly, because they're dealing with, frankly, some. These are not bad stories. Again, I would put this up against any of the 60 stuff we watched any day of the week, but um, season one is a really strong season. So
yeah,
this is I did this because I wanted to show both Watsons, and I wanted to show a representative sample of styles of Holmes and how Brett adapts to each of them. So that's the reason why I made the choices I did. And in terms of just watching the show, I genuinely think it is better to just watch season one and see what you think, because frankly, episode one, season one is great. It's the Irene Adler story. And then from there, it's just Brett probably at his heights. And I hate to say this, but really, you could see the diminish over time. Uh, uh, and later on, they start getting into movie length episodes because Morse was doing really well on ITV as 2 hour episodes. Um, and there's a whole, I didn't realize this until I started digging deep in, but like Sharp is all 2 hour episodes. So like late 80s through the 90s, there was this time of television where you made just two or three 2 hour movies, and that was your show. And that's one of the reasons why the BBC Sherlock has the format it does. But I didn't even know that was the format thing. And so they felt like the Sherlock Holmes show had to pivot to fit that format, and not realizing that the Inspector Morse things were we're adapting a whole novel to a 2 hour movie, and they're trying to take a 30-page short story and expand it to 2 hours. So that doesn't do any favors either.
but that's kind of similar to like Foyle's War that I keep talking about, because those are about 90 to 120 minutes. But I want to say they're also based on books
Right.
to do that sort of thing. Which, in one sense, so that follows the American format of Columbo from the 60s, where Columbo was a series of 2 hour movies basically to form a television
Right, but they
series.
were divided into part one, part two. Everything was part one, part two.
I don't know.
Oh, were they actually 2 hour movies? I thought they were like, you know what?
If you
I'm
go
thinking of a
back,
different show.
if you go back and watch, at least you watch the first season of it, it's like a 2 hour movie that comes out, 2 hour movie, because Peter Falk, I think, was busy at the time, but he also wanted the quality of that extra 2 hour budget that would have given them. So then
Hmm.
he could come in with like his trench coat from home full of whatever he had in his pockets that day. Fucking brilliant. We're gonna have to cover Columbo someday.
I think so. Because it just reminds me. I don't think I've actually watched Columbo. Now I'm looking at it. Holy shit, there are 10 seasons of Columbo.
Yeah.
But you're right. The first pilot episodes are both like hour and a half, and then from there they're all like 72, 80, 90 minutes. So yeah, you're right. My bad.
Yeah. I know my Columbo.
Oh yeah, sure. I realize I'm thinking of the second Russian Sherlock Holmes series, which is basically it was 7 movies, but they cut them into 14 episodes, and so it's
Okay.
always a clear part one, part two, part one, part two, part one, part two.
We may end up just all right. We're just so people know, after we do finish the Sherlock run, we're gonna take a drastic turn to something else before we become a mystery podcast instead of going
Right,
directly like into Columbo or other mystery shows.
right. A lot of times we say we're gonna do this. It's usually we'll do this in like a year or so. That's usually how it's been going.
Okay, Eddie. Any closing thoughts on the amazing Jeremy Brett run?
I mean, there's a reason we talked over 2 hours about this, right? I mean, it's something it's a show that we're both passionate about. Frankly, I think this show is part of the reason we decided to even do this run is because of a chance to talk about this show.
Yeah.
Uh, and I think it helps seeing Brett in context of what came before, what comes after. I do think that it's good reason we're doing kind of it this way because Brett is a linchpin in much the same way that we got a chance to appreciate some of the 50s and 60s stuff in contrast of Rathbone. But there is a reason why Brett was the best. And this is a show that has really continues to age well. Like I said, I have the Blu-ray version, and because this whole series was shot on film, so that means the Blu-ray upscales are they're just gorgeous. Yeah, this is a fantastic series.
Now, having rewatched at least the episode from the first season, I may need to go back and buy them on Blu-ray just
Hmm.
so that I own them and I can rewatch all the first season.
Yeah, yeah. I think you can get just because they're actually seasons are different names. There's the Adventures, much like the books. The first season's the Adventures. This is the Cases, and I don't remember anyway. Um,
You know I'm a
but yeah,
collector. You know I'm gonna have to
right.
get
So I
all of
mean,
it.
you might
It's
look at the whole set, but I will say the Blu-ray set I got at least reordered it a little bit, so they're not actually in season order. They moved all of the movies to a separate chunk of the
hmm,
discs.
interesting.
Um, so it's slightly out of order, but the way these things are set up, it doesn't really matter. Um, so be aware of that. But yeah, like if you do get it from the Blu-ray set, the stuff we're talking about season one is basically the adventures, and that's frankly I think the high point. It's not the show gets bad after that. It's just the show is never quite as good.
I think we may have fallen out of the habit of doing this, but Eddie, what should people go and watch before they come back next time to jump in with us for more Holmesian shenanigans?
Oh no, we've been doing this. Next we're gonna cover the incident at Victoria Falls. So this is in 1990s. Christopher Lee as Sherlock Holmes. And this was a weird one because there was an attempt to do a series of Holmes called The Golden Years of Sherlock Holmes. That was an attempt to do a TV series of Holmes in his much later years. Ended up getting changed into a couple of 3-hour films. So we're watching two films which would have been 4 episodes because it was kind of serialized. It was a very
Hmm.
strange production of the 90s. But it is also Holmes meets Lily Langtry and Theodore Roosevelt. So it's an experience. And it's Christopher Lee playing Sherlock Holmes. So it's gonna be I can't even tell you. It's gonna be experience. Also,
All right.
it fits in the 90s format. So we needed something to fit into this decade, and this is what we had.
I look forward to seeing Saruman do some deductions.
It
If
is a lot.
people are looking to support you or find you online, where could they do such things?
You can find me online at Pugsteady. That is my website. That's where you can find me online, primarily these days on Blue Sky. That's kind of where I've settled on my work social media network of choice. But otherwise, you can find me on Darker Hue Discord and me desperately trying not to post my latest Marvel Snap decks because I'm building Marvel Snap decks because I'm back in. I thought I got out, but they dragged me back in. How about
I'm
you?
sure that people would love to see those decks if you would post them, and you'd get lots of talk about them.
I'm trying to get a blue Marvel deck to work so bad. I actually made a deck because I have almost all the characters from the Ultimates. I tried to make a deck, and it doesn't quite work, and I'm mad about that.
Oh, some people probably say the same thing about that amazing comic book series. If you're looking
Yeah,
for me, you can find me in the Darker Hue Discord. Probably not this week or next week, because I've been super busy with work. So I've been posting a lot less, and I'm doing some freelance work right now that's taking a lot of time. If you're
yeah.
looking to support me, you could join my Patreon, where I occasionally make a random post, and we give an different episode of John Willis. Or you can come to the website and buy Haunted West, or go to Chaosium's website and buy second edition of Harlem Unbound.
That
Otherwise,
was
I'll be seeing you.